Have you ever wondered why, no matter how hard you try, no matter how many self-help books you read or morning routines you build, something invisible keeps pulling you back down? Like there's a ceiling you can't break through, and the harder you push, the more exhausted you become? What if I told you that Carl Jung, one of the most brilliant minds in the history of human psychology, identified the exact reason this happens, and it has nothing to do with your effort, your intelligence, or your willpower? Stay with me until the very end of this video, because I'm going to walk you through 7 unconscious patterns that are silently draining your energy, keeping your emotional frequency stuck at the floor, and blocking you from the life you can actually feel you're supposed to be living. By the time we're done, you'll have something most people never get: a map of your own invisible interior, and the clarity to finally start changing it. Let's start with something uncomfortable. Most people who feel chronically low-stuck, unmotivated, drained, disconnected believe the problem is outside of them. A bad job, a difficult relationship, not enough money, the wrong city. And so they spend their lives rearranging the furniture, hoping that if they just get the external conditions right, they'll finally feel okay. But Jung saw something far deeper. He spent decades studying the human mind, and what he found was this: the greatest source of human suffering isn't what happens to us, it's what we refuse to look at within ourselves. The unconscious mind, that vast, dark, largely unexplored territory beneath our everyday awareness, is not passive. It is active. It is always working. And when we leave it unexamined, it runs us. It makes our choices before we're even conscious we're choosing. It shapes our emotional frequency from the inside out. And no amount of positive thinking on the surface can override what's running the show underneath. Jung called this the shadow. But the shadow isn't just one thing. It's a collection of patterns, behaviors, beliefs, emotional reflexes that we developed early in life and then buried because they were too painful, too inconvenient, or too threatening to acknowledge. And here's what most people don't realize: those buried patterns don't disappear. They calcify. They become invisible operating systems that determine how high your energy can go, how deep your relationships can be, and how much joy you're actually capable of receiving. 7 of those patterns are doing the most damage, and we're going to go through every single one today. The first pattern is what Jung called identification with the persona. Now, the persona is the mask we wear for the world. It's not inherently bad. We all need to navigate social life, professional expectations, family roles. But when you become so fused with your persona that you forget it's a mask, something dangerous happens. You start living entirely for external approval. Every decision filters through the question, what will people think? You curate your life for an audience instead of living it for yourself. And on the energetic level, this is absolutely exhausting. Think about what it takes to constantly manage how you appear, to monitor every word, every reaction, every emotion before it escapes, to suppress what you actually feel because it doesn't fit the image you've constructed. It's like running a second operating system in the background 24 hours a day, always consuming power, always draining resources, always leaving you feeling vaguely hollow no matter how polished you look on the outside. Jung said that the persona is a compromise between the individual and society about what a person should appear to be. The word compromise is important, because a compromise means something gets left out. And what gets left out? Your authentic feelings, your real desires, your true nature, doesn't just sit quietly in a corner. It accumulates pressure. It finds indirect ways to express itself. It bleeds into anxiety, into restlessness, into that gnawing feeling that something is missing even when everything looks fine. If your vibration is chronically low, one of the first questions to ask yourself honestly is this: how much of my daily energy is spent performing rather than being? And this connects directly to the second pattern, which is shadow repression. This one is arguably the most foundational concept in all of Jungian psychology, and it explains so much about why high-functioning people can still feel profoundly miserable. The shadow is the part of yourself you've decided is unacceptable. Anger, jealousy, selfishness, neediness, ambition, sexuality, grief, whatever you were taught was wrong, weak, inappropriate, or shameful, you pushed into the shadow. You didn't destroy it. You can't. You just hid it from your own awareness. And now it sits in the unconscious. And here's where it gets really interesting. It projects. When something in another person triggers a disproportionate reaction in you, when you find yourself irrationally irritated, deeply envious, or inexplicably drawn to someone, you are almost always looking at your own shadow material reflected back at you. But more relevant to the question of vibration is this: shadow repression requires enormous psychological energy. Keeping things buried is hard work. It's the mental equivalent of holding a beach ball underwater. You can do it, but your arms are always full, and you're always a little tense, always a little vigilant, always using resources you could be directing toward actually living your life. Every part of yourself you refuse to acknowledge is a drain on your total energetic output. Jung was absolutely clear that the path to wholeness, which is the path to genuinely higher functioning and emotional freedom, runs straight through the shadow, not around it. You cannot transcend what you refuse to face. Here's something that might stop you in your tracks for a second. The people in your life who annoy you the most, who get under your skin the deepest, they are almost always showing you something about yourself that you haven't integrated yet. That's not comfortable to hear, but sit with it. Because when you start doing shadow work, when you turn toward those uncomfortable feelings instead of away from them, you get back an enormous amount of energy that has been quietly stolen from you for years. The third pattern is the mother or father complex, and this one operates so far beneath conscious awareness that most people live their entire lives without ever recognizing its influence. Jung identified a complex as an emotionally charged cluster of associations, essentially a wound organized around a core experience, usually formed in childhood, that then functions like an autonomous subpersonality inside you. And the most powerful complexes of all are built around our earliest experiences with our caregivers. If your mother was emotionally unavailable, critical, or unpredictable, you may have developed what Jung called a negative mother complex, an internal template that tells you at the unconscious level that love is conditional, that you must earn safety, that intimacy leads to pain. If your father was absent, harsh, or demanded performance before affection, a negative father complex can leave you perpetually seeking external authority and validation, or alternatively, locked in reflexive rebellion against any form of structure or commitment. These complexes don't just affect your relationships, though they absolutely devastate your relationships. They set your baseline emotional frequency. They are the invisible thermostat in your psyche. And just like a thermostat, when your emotional state begins to rise when things start going well, when you start feeling genuinely good, the complex kicks in and brings you back down to its set point. This is why so many people sabotage themselves right at the threshold of success or happiness. It's not self-hatred. It's the complex doing its job, returning you to the familiar emotional temperature it was built around. Jung said that complexes are not necessarily pathological, they are entirely normal features of the human psyche. But unexamined, they are among the most powerful forces keeping your vibration locked in place. This is also why talk therapy alone is often not enough to break these patterns, because complexes live in the body as much as the mind. They are encoded in your nervous system, in your automatic reactions, in the way your chest tightens before a difficult conversation or your stomach drops when someone raises their voice. Real healing of the complex requires not just intellectual understanding, but what Jung called the confrontation with the unconscious, a willingness to actually feel and metabolize the stored emotional charge that the complex is built around. And that is some of the deepest, most rewarding inner work a human being can do. The fourth pattern is chronic projection. We touched on this briefly when talking about the shadow, but it deserves its own serious examination because it is one of the most pervasive and most costly unconscious behaviors that keeps people energetically depleted. Projection, in the Jungian sense, means seeing in the outer world what is actually inside yourself. It happens automatically, below the threshold of awareness, and it runs the show in most people's emotional lives in ways they simply cannot see. When you project your own unacknowledged anger onto a partner and experience them as constantly aggressive, you're projecting. When you project your own unconscious hunger for success onto a colleague and experience them as threatening or arrogant, when you project your own repressed grief onto a sad film and cry for 20 minutes over a story that objectively isn't that emotionally complex, you're projecting. Now, why does this drain your vibration so severely? Because projection fundamentally prevents you from seeing reality clearly. And when you can't see clearly, you're constantly reacting to a distorted version of the world. You're fighting battles that aren't happening. You're misreading situations and people. You're generating emotional responses to events that exist primarily in your own internal landscape. This creates a constant low-grade static in your emotional experience, a kind of exhausting background noise of misattributed feeling, of drama that feels real but is actually generated from within. Jung said that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to a better understanding of ourselves. That's a beautiful reframe. But it requires the humility to turn the arrow around, to ask not what is wrong with them, but what is this showing me about myself? When you pull your projections back, when you do the work of reclaiming what you've projected onto others, you get back a tremendous amount of clarity. And with that clarity comes a dramatic increase in the quality of your emotional experience. Things that used to feel electric with danger or resentment or longing start to settle. Life becomes quieter in the best possible way. Your bandwidth opens up. Your vibration rises because it's no longer being constantly hijacked by reactions to your own unacknowledged interior. Now here's where things get particularly deep, and I want you to really stay with this next one. The fifth pattern is the failure to individuate. Individuation is Jung's central concept. It's the lifelong process of becoming who you most deeply and authentically are. not who your parents needed you to be, not who your culture told you to be, not the person your trauma shaped you into. Your actual self, the full, integrated, complex, genuine human being that is uniquely you. Jung believed that the drive toward individuation is one of the most powerful forces in the human psyche, and when that drive is consistently blocked or ignored, the result is what he called a loss of soul, a feeling of emptiness, purposelessness, flatness, a low vibration that no external achievement can lift because the problem isn't external. Here's how the failure to individuate typically plays out in modern life. You follow the path of least resistance. You take the career that makes practical sense or that pleases your parents. You stay in the relationship that's comfortable rather than the one that genuinely enlarges you. You spend your years being useful to everyone else and chronically neglecting the development of your own inner life. You read all the right books but never actually change. You know what your values are in theory, but don't live by them in practice. And you arrive at some point in your 30s, 40s, or 50s with the creeping, terrifying suspicion that you've been living someone else's life. Jung called this the midlife crisis, but he didn't mean it derogatorily. He saw it as a summons, the psyche's desperate attempt to redirect you toward the process of individuation before it was too late. The crisis is not the problem. The crisis is the cure trying to happen. But most people respond to that summons by buying a sports car or changing jobs or finding a new relationship, rearranging the external again, rather than doing the deeper work of actually confronting who they are and who they're failing to become. The energetic cost of failing to individuate is immense. It shows up as chronic low-grade depression, not the clinical kind necessarily, but that heavy, colorless feeling that something vital is missing. It shows up as a kind of emotional numbness, a flat effect that no amount of excitement or stimulation can shake. It shows up as an inability to be genuinely enthusiastic, because enthusiasm requires authentic connection to what you actually care about, and when you're living at a distance from your own authentic self, that connection is broken. The sixth pattern is what we might call the tyranny of the unconscious anima or animus. This requires a little explanation, but it is well worth your attention. Jung identified within the male psyche an unconscious feminine aspect he called the anima, and within the female psyche an unconscious masculine aspect he called the animus. These are not literal genders, they are psychological principles. The anima in a man represents his capacity for feeling, relatedness, imagination, and receptivity. The animus in a woman represents her capacity for direction, logic, initiative, and assertion. When these inner figures are unconscious, when they haven't been recognized, related to, or integrated, they operate autonomously. They hijack your emotional life in ways that feel completely real and completely external, but are actually being driven from inside. In a man, an unintegrated anima shows up as sudden, irrational moods, profound sensitivity to criticism that produces wildly outsized reactions, a tendency to be controlled by emotional weather rather than directing it, and a compulsive seeking of the perfect woman who will somehow complete him, a seeking that can never be satisfied because what he's actually looking for is within himself. In a woman, an unintegrated animus shows up as harsh self-criticism that sounds like a voice of authority, a tendency toward opinionated certainty without flexibility, unconscious sabotage of her own creative impulses, and a compulsive seeking of the strong man who will give her life direction again. A seeking that cannot be satisfied because the direction she craves is her own inner masculine principle, unawakened. Why does this drain vibration? Because when the anima or animus is unconscious, you're outsourcing huge chunks of your own psychological wholeness to other people. You're dependent on external relationships to provide what can only ultimately be found within. That dependency creates anxiety, neediness, volatility, and a kind of existential insecurity that no relationship can resolve. Every disappointment in love feels catastrophic because unconsciously you're not just losing a partner, you're losing access to a part of yourself. The work of integrating the anima or animus of learning to embody within yourself the qualities you've been seeking outside is one of the most liberating and vibration-raising processes available to any human being. And it's one almost nobody talks about. The seventh and final pattern is what Jung called participation mystique, a term he borrowed from the anthropologist Ulrich Brühl, but which in modern terms we might describe as unconscious enmeshment or psychological fusion. This is the state of being merged with your environment, your family, your culture, your group identity, to the point where you don't actually have a distinct inner life of your own. Your moods are regulated entirely by what's happening around you. When the people in your life are happy, you feel okay. When they're stressed or unhappy, you absorb that, and it becomes yours. You have no stable internal ground to stand on, because you've never developed one. This pattern is incredibly common and almost entirely invisible in our culture, because our culture actually rewards it. Being highly responsive to social cues, conforming to group norms, being agreeable and accommodating these are not typically identified as psychological problems. They're called being a good person, or being easy to get along with, or being a team player. But Jung recognized that a psyche without a stable, differentiated center is a psyche that cannot sustain high vibration. It's like trying to hold a frequency with an antenna that's picking up every signal in the environment with no filter. The static is constant. The signal, your own authentic frequency, gets completely buried under the noise. Participation mystique also manifests as what many people today call being an empath, though Jung would have framed it very differently. When you are psychologically undifferentiated from your environment, you do indeed feel other people's emotions acutely, but not because you have some special sensitivity. Because you have no psychic boundary, no developed sense of where you end and another begins. The solution is not to build walls. The solution is to develop what Jung called the self a stable center of psychological gravity from which you can genuinely engage with the world, feel deeply for others, and still return to yourself intact. Now I want to fulfill the promise I made at the very beginning of this video. I told you that by the end, you would have something most people never get: a map of your own invisible interior. And here it is. The 7 patterns we've walked through together are not separate problems. They are expressions of the same underlying condition: an unconscious relationship with your own inner life. The persona that has become a prison, the shadow you've been running from for years, the complexes built around early wounds, the projections keeping you trapped in a distorted version of reality, the failure to answer the call toward your own authentic becoming, the inner figures you've been seeking outside yourself. and the loss of your own center through constant merger with the world around you. Every single one of these patterns has one thing in common. They all involve an unconscious relationship with some aspect of yourself. And the way through the path that Jung spent his entire life mapping is consciousness, not perfection, not the elimination of the unconscious, not the achievement of some permanently elevated state, simply the willingness to look, to turn toward the interior instead of away from it, to bring a flashlight into the basement rather than pretending the basement doesn't exist. Jung said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Read that again slowly. The things you experience as just happening to you, the patterns that keep repeating, the relationships that keep failing in the same ways, the opportunities that keep slipping through your fingers, the low feeling that never quite lifts those things are not happening to you. They are happening from you, from the parts of yourself you haven't yet met. And when you meet them, when you turn toward them with honest curiosity instead of fear or shame, something remarkable begins to happen. The energy that was locked in repression starts to free up. The distortions created by projection begin to clear. The automatic self-sabotage driven by unexamined complexes starts to lose its grip. The hollow performance of the persona starts to give way to something that feels genuinely alive. This is not a quick fix. Jung was deeply suspicious of quick fixes. He believed that genuine psychological development was the work of a lifetime, not a weekend seminar. But the direction matters more than the speed. One honest look in the right direction, one genuine moment of turning toward a shadow piece you've been avoiding, one real recognition of a projection, one authentic question about whether you're living your life or someone else's, that one moment shifts something. And those shifts accumulate, and what was chronically low begins, slowly, unmistakably, to lift. Here's the practical threshold you can cross right now, today, without any special training or tools. Pick one person in your life who consistently triggers a strong negative reaction in you. Write down the 3 qualities about them that bother you most. Then, and this requires real courage, ask yourself honestly, where do I see any version of these qualities in myself? Not an identical version, a version. Maybe you hate their arrogance, and you have to admit there's a part of you that desperately wants recognition, but has been too afraid to acknowledge it. Maybe you hate their emotional avoidance, and you have to face the fact that you've been avoiding your own grief for a decade. Whatever comes up, don't judge it, just see it. That act of seeing is the beginning of everything. Another practice drawn directly from Jungian work is active imagination, sitting with an uncomfortable feeling or recurring image and actually engaging with it internally as you would engage with a person, asking it what it wants, listening for its answer. This sounds strange if you're approaching it from a purely rational framework, but Jung demonstrated across a lifetime of clinical work that the unconscious has something like intelligence, something like intention, and when you actually dialogue with it rather than suppress or override it, it reveals information that can fundamentally change the direction of your life. And journaling, not the diary kind, but the kind where you write toward the unknown, where you begin a sentence without knowing how it ends, where you let the pen move and you notice with curiosity what comes out. This is one of the most accessible tools for beginning to hear the voice of your own deeper self beneath the noise of the persona and the constant management of appearance. The vibration question comes down to this: how much of your total psychological energy is available for actually living your life right now. Because every unintegrated shadow piece, every unexamined complex, every projection you're carrying, every persona performance you're maintaining, every part of yourself you're in conflict with, all of that is consuming bandwidth. It's running in the background, draining the battery, dimming the signal. And the work of Jungian psychology, the deep, courageous, lifelong work of individuation, is essentially the work of reclaiming that bandwidth. Piece by piece, pattern by pattern, becoming more whole, more genuinely yourself, more energetically free. This is what Jung meant when he said that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Not who you were shaped to be by your wounds, not who you perform for the world, not who your parents needed you to be or your culture expects you to remain, but the full, luminous, complex, undefended, genuinely alive human being that was always in there, waiting beneath the patterns. That is the version of you that doesn't have a low vibration problem. That is the version of you that doesn't need to manage its energy or protect its frequency from the outside world, because the inner life is coherent, integrated, and genuinely its own. And reaching that is worth every moment of the honest, sometimes uncomfortable, deeply rewarding inner work it takes to get there. I want to hear from you, seriously. Which one of these 7 patterns landed the hardest? Which one made you stop and think, yeah, that's me? Drop it in the comments below, right now. Because I read every single one, and your honest reflection might be exactly what someone else needed to hear. There are thousands of people watching this video who are in the exact same place you are, carrying the same invisible weight, wondering why they can't break through. Your voice matters here. And if this kind of content speaks to you, if you're serious about doing this deeper work, about understanding your own psychology at the level that actually creates lasting change, then please subscribe to Carl Jung Psychology Hub right now. Because this channel is dedicated to exactly this kind of deep, real, life-changing exploration of the human mind. And we publish this content regularly. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join a community of people who are genuinely committed to becoming more whole, more free, and more fully alive.